We're going to be talking about, if this works, yeah, there we go. We're going to talk about evidences for God. And as we start talking about the topic, sort of introduced it last week by saying bring your favorite one. When we think about why we would talk about this, it's because it's a question that is coming up increasingly. And the good news is that even though you have a trend where you have a downward trend line in the number of people who self-identify as being Christian, you have an upward trend in the number of people who are identifying as believing in some sort of higher power. And so your job, then our job as believers, is to go and find these people who believe that there is something that has brought about the universe and explain to them who that is. And I think all you're seeing in that downward trend line is really just the correction of an inflated number because of the cultural influence that Christianity would have in our culture. People are culturally Christian a lot of times. And now, as that's no longer really a stigma to say, well, I'm not a Christian, it's becoming less and less of a stigma, you're just seeing people who don't go along with the status quo. And so you'll read articles and hear things about how this is a disaster, and really, it actually is a good thing because we're seeing maybe for the first time in a while a truer accounting of what is going on in our culture. And we see an increase actually in the number of people who are believing in some sort of higher power, which is good because you find them, you explain to them who that is, and then you can teach them. And so when we think about evidences for God, one of the ways that I like to start talking about it is that there's different types of reasoning. And you have basically inductive and deductive reasoning. Those are the two big primary types that people will often talk about if you go through a logic course. And you induce, you start off with induction, you gather evidence, and you have all these little bits and points of data, and then you build that up into a general law. So you'll go out, if you're an archaeologist, and you'll gather all sorts of bone fragments and get all this information, and then you'll come up with some sort of general rule or general law. That's how science works. You go and you experiment, you observe, you collect data, and then you try and come up with some kind of conclusion if there's some kind of natural law or some type of truth that we can learn. You might do this in the Bible. If you're going through and you're studying a topic like baptism, for example, you might go through and gather all the places where baptism is discussed or all the places where water is discussed and look at the evidence from that and come to a conclusive answer about what is the truth concerning, or is there a general rule concerning baptism. And then once you have those general rules in place, which you get to through induction, then you're at a place where you can begin to deduce. So induction goes from a bunch of data to a universal or general truth, and deduction goes from the general truth down to a specific instance. So you'll start with something like, all dogs have 4 legs. This is one of my favorite examples of syllogistic logic. Well, that's a general truth, right? You would agree, I would hope, that most dogs, right, the general design for a dog is quadruped. It's got 4 legs, 4 feet. Then you would look at an animal, and you would observe a specific instance of an animal, and you would say, this furry thing has 4 legs, so this furry thing must be a dog. So you have begun with your general truth. You've looked at some specific instances, and using your general truth, you've deduced that this furry thing that you're staring at is a dog. It's actually a cat because there's more general truths about dogs than they just have 4 legs. So anytime you're moving from one to the other, it's very possible to make mistakes. That's where we have logical fallacies and confirmation bias and all these things that you might hear get tossed around in politics and the news the past 2,000 years or so. And so that's basically what we're looking at. These two different types of reasoning is inductive and deductive reasoning. And when we start coming with evidence for God, what we're looking for is you're looking for that inductive approach. You're looking for information that you see around you and moving from that information to the general rule that God exists, that there is some God. And the thing about this process is that's about as far as you can get. You can't induce Jesus, right? I mean, you can't go measure the bark on trees and, oh, Jesus is the Messiah. It doesn't work that way. And so what we're looking at tonight really, specifically, is just trying to get somebody from the point of, I'm not sure if there is a God, to, oh, okay, I believe that there is a higher power. And once you get them there, then you can begin arguing for the God that you see in Scripture. Does that make sense? Okay. And so we're talking about evidence tonight because we're searching for that general truth. Purposefully avoided using the word proof. What is the difference, in your mind, what is the difference between evidence and proof? No, yeah. With evidence and truth, evidence should lead you to truth. And why are we saying we have evidence for God and not proof of God's existence? Why do we use the word evidence and not proof? And you can if you want, right? Like when you're talking with your friends or family, if you want to use the word proof, go ahead. I personally avoid that word, and there's a reason why. Yes. Sure. Yes. Proof. Proof. Oof. Proof. Anyway, yes, proof. Proof. Yes. But everything that's been said about truth is good. So, no, what you said was good. But in your mind, those two words, do they conjure different concepts? Yeah, and studies have actually been done, not by me, right, but by religious people have done these studies, and they have determined that the word proof has a negative reaction from people who aren't believers. When you're going to prove God's existence, you kind of get the eye roll, right, because it's already a foregone conclusion if you've got this proof. So the word evidence is just a better word, and it really is a better word describing the process that we're going through. If we're going to induce something, anytime you induce something, you go from all this, general, this specific data, and you're going to a general or universal truth, it's very easy to make mistakes. And since that's how science works, that's why science is always self-correcting, right? At least in theory. So you'll observe things, you'll come up with a theory, you'll observe more things, and you find out your theory was wrong, so you amend the theory, and you keep going back and forth. For example, that new telescope that they put up in space, there's a really big theory that they just found out is not right. Does anybody know what that was, watching the headlines? The Big Bang theory. Right, they've gathered new data, and they're like, that's totally wrong. That's a pretty big mistake, right? But they, big, yeah. And so what they've done is they've gathered more specific data, and they come and they say this thing that we thought was universally true is no longer universally true. We might not be like totally wrong, but we weren't right either. And so you make changes. Anytime you go from specific to universal, you cannot be sure of your conclusion. That's just the nature of logic. And so we're going from observations, specific observations to a general universal truth, there is a God. To be fair, right? Just to be fair to the laws and rules of logic, you can't call that proof, right? It's evidence. And so while you can be like really, really, really sure it's not the smoking gun, the 100% conclusive thing, because that's just not the way the logical process works, which is why you hear things like the theory of evolution or the theory of gravity. How many of you doubt gravity? Yeah, you see it, right? It's there. But in science, it's still called the theory of gravity because we arrive to our understanding of it through induction. Right? We see all these things happen and we say, well, we'll describe it this way. Well, we might learn something tomorrow that totally changes the way that we think about gravity. Even though we know it's real, our description, our understanding of it can grow and change. So we have to be careful that we're using words, first of all, that don't cause people to have knee-jerk emotional reactions to what we're saying. But we also want to try to be as accurate in our description of what we're really doing as possible. Because if anybody knows logic really well and you say, I'm going to prove to you that God exists, they're going to be like, plebeian, right? Maybe they won't say that, right? But they're going to, no, you can't do that. And they'll be right. And so I just try to avoid that whole controversy at the outset. Let's look at evidence. And I like to say things, let's go where the evidence leads us. If the evidence leads us to God, then we will follow it there. And if at any point the evidence takes us away from God, we'll follow it there too, because we're interested in what is true. And most people will agree to that if you want to sit down and have those types of conversations. So as we're looking for evidence, there are some things, right, that you will be able to prove. You see proof happening in Scripture. You see, like in Acts chapter 9 and verse 22, it says that Paul was proving that Jesus was the Christ. Well, he does that because he starts with something that is already accepted as generally true. And once you get somebody to believe that there is a God, and once you get somebody to believe that Scripture is breathed out by God, then you can begin to prove things to them from those generally accepted truths. And that's what Paul does. He goes to the passages about the Messiah. He shows how Jesus fulfills those, and then you do sort of have, the smoking gun, the 100% you can know for sure type of situation, because we're going from the general universal down to the specific. The same thing is going to be true in Acts 17, where Paul is going to use Scripture to show and prove to people that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, you can be wrong when you do this. Have you ever used the Bible and been wrong about your conclusion? I never have. All the time, right? All the time. And an example of this in the Scripture of somebody using the Bible, thinking that they're proving something but being very wrong, are the Pharisees in John chapter 7. Right? They are going to say, search the Scriptures and see that no prophet arises from Galilee. There is a prophet from Galilee. Jonah. Jonah is from Galilee. They're just wrong. And the reason why they're wrong is because they didn't have all the data. And they're trying to prove something, but they're leaving data out, and so you make mistakes, as people do. You'll see the same sorts of things when you talk about baptism. People want to leave some verses out, or they want to bring verses in that really have nothing to do with baptism, and so you're sort of tainting your pool of information, and you wind up with bad conclusions because you've put bad data into the process. And so it's possible to prove things using Scripture, and you can be right or wrong, depending on how you work through the process. So then we've got to think about, not only do we have these different types of reasoning, inductive and deductive, and you use them different ways, but we have different types of evidence. And the first that we'll kind of talk about is existential or empirical evidence. And it's just the stuff that you see, the things you can measure and observe and look at the world around you. The stuff that exists is sort of the way that I tend to think about that in my mind. And sometimes, depending on who you're reading or talking to, these words will be used interchangeably, empirical or existential. And it's just stuff that can be observed or measured in some way. Now, is this bad or is this good? Because we're trying to talk about a God who has no physical form, who you can't touch or taste or see or smell. But is this type of evidence going to be helpful to us? Absolutely, it's part of the equation, yeah. What are some things that we might measure that could help us see that there is a God? And measure might not be a good word. Observe. Nature. Yeah. All the stuff out there, right? It had to come from some place. Well, you see all of that stuff. You're going to measure it and count it and look at it, right? That's empirical evidence. It's existential evidence. You're not in a laboratory running experiments necessarily, but you're dealing with things that can be counted and touched and tasted and all of that. So it falls under this category, this type of things that you can measure. You see this also in Scripture. For example, when Jesus is raised from the dead, there are some of his disciples who believe, and there's one who doesn't, Thomas. What does Thomas want? He wants to touch Jesus. He says, until I can touch his wounds, I won't believe. So what he's asking for is evidence. Right? He wants this. He wants existential evidence. Now, I can't do that. Right? I mean, Jesus could appear next to me and say, here, touch my hand, but it hasn't happened yet. So I'm in a different situation than Thomas. So as far as like direct evidence about Jesus, I don't get to have that. But when I look at the world around me, there is all kinds of stuff we can measure. We can measure the background radiation in space. We can measure the distance from stars, the shift in light. We can measure how fast things grow. We can look at the age of the earth. I mean, all sorts of stuff we can measure. It's a big world, and God has given us all sorts of fun things to go and observe. Right? So there's a lot. And when we see Scripture, Scripture tells us that this is something we should be doing. What declares the glory of God? The heavens. The heavens declare the glory of God. Well, the last time I sat outside and listened, they didn't talk. So how do they declare the glory of God? Yeah, you have to. Yeah, you observe it. You go and you see it. Now, sometimes it's just, wow, this is incredible. Like when you go to the Grand Canyon. I've never been. But I hear that when you go, there's like that sort of feeling. You're just like, this is unbelievably beautiful. When we first moved to Middle Tennessee, that was sort of how we felt. We're like, wow, this place is unbelievably beautiful. And we still go outside every day. We're like, I can't believe we live here. This is the Garden of Eden. Must have been just south of Nashville. I'm sure that's where it was. And you just see these things, and it's beautiful. But then you can also measure them. And you can look at stars. And in fact, in the early 20th century, one of the greatest thinkers in human history called the observation of stars the greatest blunder of his career. Albert Einstein was a physicist, and he believed that the universe was infinitely old. Because that was a really common thing to think. For a long time, people believed that the universe was just infinitely old. And he believed that. And so a lot of his theories about trying to find a unified theory of science, of creation, which is just one theory that explains everything. In the search for that, he was working with an infinitely old universe in his theories. And then there's this guy named Edwin Hubble, who the first telescope was named after. And he starts measuring stars. And he realizes that the light, as the light leaves a star and comes to the Earth, that light gets stretched out. Because the universe is expanding. What is it expanding into? I don't know. Anyway, the universe is expanding, and so the light, as it's traveling across that space that is getting bigger, gets stretched. And so he measured the stretching in that light, and he was able to come up with an equation that told us about how old the universe was based on that observation. Anybody want to come up or guess at what number he arrived at? If you go to a science class today, how old are they going to tell you the universe is? Billions. Yeah, 13.4. Sometimes you'll hear 14.3. And all of those are just tweaks using the Hubble constant. Right? That number that you hear, 14 billion, 13 billion, that comes from Edwin Hubble. He's the one who came up with that. Well, what that does is that observation tells you that the universe is not infinitely old, which means that at some point the universe had to what? Start. And everything that starts needs a starter. Somebody to pull the crank to get the motor going. Right? So this was catastrophic for people who believed in an infinitely old universe that didn't need a God, because now you have a universe with a beginning, and if it has a beginning, it needs a starter, and that's where you get the whole Big Bang thing from, and now we've observed that, and we're like, nah, that's not right. Now, they don't know what they're going to replace that with yet, I don't think, but they know that that wasn't right. Yes, yes. Are we going to talk about that later, maybe? We'll talk about that later. Yeah, want me to come back to that. Okay, so the next is experiential evidence. The things that you experience. Your experiences are going to be different than mine, and so the way that you understand things is going to be a little bit different than mine. Well, whose experiences are true? Yes. They're all true. Now, we have to be careful, right? Because this is all this information is just a piece of the puzzle. And so just because you experience something doesn't mean that you should base everything in life off of your experiences, because I've misheard things, I've misseen things, I've misremembered things, and so there's all sorts of, again, problems that might enter in. And so what we're looking at is sometimes things are experienced by one person, and it doesn't make it not true. When God comes to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 and says, I want you to get your family and go to the place I'm going to show you, how many people did he tell? One. I'm sure Abraham probably told the people that went with him, but God told one. So Abraham had this experience where God came and told him, go to this place. Now, it's right for him to go. And so there will be all sorts of things like that. For example, maybe you were little, your mom cut lunch meat, and there was a giant artery in the piece of ham that she gave you, and so from that point forward you have learned that ham is anathema, and you never, ever, ever, ever eat it. I mean, you will, but you don't like it, because every time you're back in 3rd grade pulling the stringy artery out of your teeth, it was so nasty. Right? But you probably haven't had that experience, so you may like ham a whole lot. I like ham. I just have to avoid the stringy parts. Right? So ham's good. How many of you like pineapple on pizza? Don't raise your hands. I don't want to know. Right? Your experiences are different than mine. Who's right? Yes. We all are, right? And so sometimes these different experiences, it's okay for us to have different concepts of things. There are other times where it's not okay to have different concepts of things. It doesn't matter how many times in your experience you have felt like 2 + 2 is 7, it is always 4. Right? So we have to piece all these things together. Part of our life as believers is experience. There will be things that you experience. You will experience God's love. You will experience knowing truth. You will experience the assurance of knowing that you have been adopted into God's family. Well, the fact that I feel these things, how is that going to convince somebody that they should believe in God? Well, maybe they're looking for those things, and you can tell them that. And Karen is a lot better, believe it or not, Karen is a lot better at talking to people who aren't believers than I am. Because when I sit down with somebody, I'm like, all right, let's look at red light shift and let's look at all these factual things. And she'll go, how do you feel? Are you looking for something bigger than yourself? And they're like, yeah, I am. And I'm like, okay, let's measure stuff now. And she's like, well, hang on a minute. So yes, you can use your experiences. You can use the peace that you have that passes understanding to help people who don't know peace, who want to know peace. And you can show them that in Jesus. And so even if science isn't your thing and you don't like measuring and going through all the formulas and things, you can still work with people who are searching for God, because not everybody likes to measure stuff. And that's totally okay. All right, so this is just another piece of the puzzle. The next one is intangible evidence, like morality. How do you measure morality? Nobody knows. How do you measure logic? Are there rules for logic? Yes. Where'd they come from? Right? So these are the kinds of questions that you can ask, and this is like intangible stuff. You can't measure this. But morality is a thing. Otherwise, how do you say that the terrorists in Hezbollah are wrong? How do you say that it was wrong for Stalin to murder 20 million of his own people? Do you say that's wrong? Yeah, so you're making some kind of a moral argument. That's an intangible thing. You can't touch it, you can't measure it. And so you sort of are going through and you're like, there are things that all people in all places and all time have always agreed are not good. And stealing is not okay. And every once in a while you run across somebody who wants to be smart and they'll say something like, well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me. Steal their phone and run away. Immediately they will show you that they believe stealing is wrong. Well, why do they think it's wrong? Why is taking something that doesn't belong to you not good? Every culture across time has said that that's bad. Now, depending on the place and time where you live, sometimes it's okay to steal from some people, but there are always rules against stealing. There's always rules. There's always rules against murder. Sometimes it's okay to kill some people, but generally, murder is not okay. And so it's interesting when you go back and you look through these laws, even cannibalistic societies have had rules about who you can eat and who you can't. Isn't that weird? Like, they're going to eat you, but they're not going to murder you. I haven't worked that out in my head yet, but they did, right? And so there's all these situations where even though the laws might look a little different than ours, everybody recognizes that these types of things are wrong. So where does morality come from? Every once in a while you run into somebody who goes, well, it's just an evolutionary trend amongst humans because we have these bigger brains, and so we have developed these sort of codified systems in which we enforce morality amongst ourselves. And so it's wrong for us to kill. And so then you say things like, well, is it wrong for you to kill a cow? If killing is wrong, and we're all just animals, then wouldn't killing anything be wrong? I mean, yeah, that would be the answer. And you'll run into people who say that. They're like, yeah, killing anything is wrong. Well, plants, right? What about killing plants? Is that wrong? What was that? Yeah. So what do you eat? You're supposed to photosynthesize things. That's the secret. Just sit outside and eat. And if they say, yeah, it's wrong to kill animals, then you start asking questions like, well, is it wrong for a lion to kill a gazelle? Is that not murder? Is it wrong for a walrus to kill all those poor, hapless oysters? Have you seen Alice in Wonderland? Right? Is it wrong for the walruses to do that? Is it walruses? Not important. Right? And so when you start asking these questions, you get to the point where if human morality is only derived from the animal world, then we're going to have to start holding trials for all those leopards and lions in the savannah who are killing the poor gazelles. Or we're going to have to prosecute every cat who kills a mouse, because that's murder, if it is only a product of this evolutionary process. And so all of a sudden we find ourselves having to grapple with the fact that there is this intangible morality that has come from somewhere and nobody knows where. I can honestly only think of one answer. What would your answer be? God. Yeah, you're made in the image of God. You have a conscience. You have within you the desires of the Creator, which is why this is a universal thing amongst all people. It has always been the rules that we follow. Now, is this the smoking gun that proves 100% that there is? No, it's not, because there's all these other things that people are going to want to talk about. But is it evidence for God? Yes. And so it's part of the puzzle. The last thing we're going to look at is historical evidence. Much of what we have when we read Scripture is historical evidence. Somebody a really long time ago wrote it down, and other people have pushed it forward so that you have it sitting in front of you. The story of Jesus, the story of God's people. It's history. It's an ancient historical text. It's not just a historical text, but it exists within history. So the way that you gather historical evidence is testimony. People tell you, this is what I saw. Very much like in a courtroom, if there are eyewitnesses to some event and they call upon those eyewitnesses, you're using historical evidence. I saw this, this is what happened. You're trusting their testimony. And when it comes to religion, for some reason, people want to say, well, you can't use that. Well, why? We use it all the time. What does Abraham Lincoln look like? What was that? Ugly. He thought so too. Yeah. How do you know that? When did you see him? Last week, right? History. That's how. Napoleon was like 5'9"-ish. He's not really that short. But the British people wanted you to think he was short, so they drew a bunch of comics and cartoons making him a really short, squat fellow because it was funny. And now, because that's the documentation we have, Napoleon probably didn't go around having heralds proclaim how tall he was when he went places. And so now when people look back in history, every time you see Napoleon in a movie or a show, he's really short, right? History. We know that he wasn't that tall. He's average height. So when we start going back and we look at these things, all of this information is historical information. So when you come to Scripture and you have all of this information in Scripture, you would use it like any other historical document. And all throughout time, there have been people who testified that there was something bigger than them. They don't always agree on what it is, but they agree that there is something. And so the question is, are you going to accept the historical testimony of the collective experience of humanity or not? Now, is that going to convince every single person you ever talk to? No. But again, it's a piece of the evidence. And at the end of the day, we're going to, what's the phrase? Not beyond a reasonable doubt, but Mr. Hill, help. Preponderance of the evidence. That's what we're looking for. What direction does the preponderance of the evidence push us? That's where we're going. Okay, so we talked a little bit about morality. Any other things that y'all wanted to talk about with morality? I got ahead of myself. I don't know where it comes from, if not from God. Something has to be the moral authority. If you have no moral authority, you wind up with what you see sort of being pushed in our culture today, where there is no right or wrong. There is no correct way to go. Now, within what we have considered historically moral within humanity, are there lots of variations? Yes. Right? We're not saying that everybody in every place and every time has agreed about everything. That's not the argument. The argument is that generally people have defined morality in the same way. It's always wrong to steal. It's not okay to murder people. It was just expected that you would behave a certain way. And that allows you then to prosecute criminals because they have violated not just a penal code, but they have violated morality. And so there is a very real sense, in which you see it in Scripture even, that God created government to bear the sword against the wrongdoer. Right? How can God call it wrongdoing? Well, He's the moral authority. That's how. That's how. Okay, let's look at the creation. We were talking about this a little while ago, and we paused, and we're going to come back. Because the controversy was, is the universe infinitely old? If it's infinitely old, it never starts. If it never starts, you don't need God. What's the problem with an infinitely old universe? Nothing in reality is infinite. Nothing. It's a theory. Right? I got this wrong in a math class once. I was being cheeky, and our professor asked us to write a math problem, and so I wrote it out, and it had to have an answer, and I put an infinity in there, and infinity is not a real thing. It's concept. And so it is a conceptual understanding of how things work, but you can't have an infinity of anything. Right? Even though when you're a little kid, you're like, double stamping, no erasing, times infinity. And it doesn't work. You automatically lose if you say that because that's a conceptual thing. It's not an actual thing. So people want to make the universe infinitely old because it sounds cool, first of all, and it removes the need for God. The problem with a timeline is that in a sense it moves both directions, like you'd have to go back and you have to go forward because you have to get to where you are now. Right? History has to progress to the point so that you can get to now. And the problem with an infinitely old universe is that you have to keep going that direction. That would be forward for y'all, right? You have to keep going that direction forever until you can get to now, which means that you can never get to now. It's just impossible. And the first 1,000 times I worked through that in my brain, it absolutely didn't make sense. But the way that you can think about it is, if you want to look it up, one of the things you can look up is Zeno's paradox, and it's this idea of crossing distance. And if the distance were to be infinitely long, you could never get to your goal. Right? That makes sense, right? If you were only traveling 10 miles, you could do that. But if you had to travel an infinite number of miles, you could never finish your journey. So if time was going from the end of the bench, if that's the start of time, and you're just trying to get here to now, well, that would only take you 1,000 years. But if the timeline stretches to the corner of the building, and you were trying to get from the corner of the building and pass through time to get here, that would take 10,000 years. But if you keep moving that end back, and you move it back an infinite distance, then you have to go through an infinite number of years to get to now, which means that you can never get to now. I don't know about you, but I think we're here. Which means somehow we have managed to get to now, which means the universe cannot be infinitely old. See, that wasn't hard. We didn't need any math. Right, but that's important, because anytime somebody wants to argue, like they'll invoke all sorts of cool things, like they'll say, well, let's talk about string theory. You don't have to. You don't have to know about string theory to argue that the universe is not infinitely old. You don't have to know about any of that stuff to argue that the universe cannot be infinitely old. All you need to know is that Edwin Hubble proved it. I think it was 1903. In 1903, Edwin Hubble proved the universe is finite by measuring starlight, and even just commonsensically, but I wouldn't say that, you can't get from infinity to now. You just can't do it. And so that's why creation is important, because if the universe has a beginning, then somebody had to begin it. Even Aristotle recognized this. He was searching for the prime mover, the first mover. Everything is moved by something, but who was the one who first started the motion? So he didn't use that phrase to refer to God necessarily, but that's what he was looking for. What is the prime mover, the first mover? I don't know how to answer that. Whatever created the universe can't be part of the universe. It has to be separate from it. Yes? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. If it started, somebody had to start it. Who started it? If the universe started, something outside of it had to start it. The lawnmower can't start itself. And so whoever started the universe can't be part of it, which means that they're immaterial, which means that they're very strong, because there's lots of power in the universe, big pull cord. And they're very intelligent, because everything just works. Right? And so you have this timeless, spaceless, massless, infinitely powerful, infinitely wise thing that made everything. What does that sound like? It sounds a lot like God. Now, did that prove the God of the Bible? No. But did it prove that there is something that started everything? Yes. That one could be, because it's outside of the finite universe. And that's when, again, you'll run into people who say, well, if God started the universe, who started God? And that's when you say, God is an infinite being and has no beginning. Since he has no beginning, there is no starter. That's my answer. And some people are like, oh, that's a cop-out. Like, well, that's the God that I see described in Scripture. Don't make that voice when you're talking to them. Bad idea. That's the God I see described in Scripture. That's the God that logic would dictate. If you have everything in the universe that is contained inside of this finite thing, the one who is outside of it must be infinite. He is outside of the limited thing. If he is infinite, then he has no beginning. And having no beginning means there is no need for a starter. He's a self-starter. Not even true, because there's no beginning. It's hard to conceptualize something that has no beginning. I can't do it. I can say that a lot. I cannot imagine it. Everything in my experience has a start and a stop. God doesn't. It's very different from everything. Another thing we can look at, we'll just skip through the regularity of nature. The laws of nature. Have you ever heard anybody use that phrase before? The laws of nature. There's no such thing. And the first time I had a teacher tell me that, there are really no such thing as the laws of nature. I was like, you're silly. We talk about them all the time. And you're like, well, think about it. If right now my phone is not falling, right, it's defying the law of gravity, it's not going to get arrested. It's not a law in that sense. But what we use that term law, it's the rule, it's the norm, because that is the way things typically behave. And it just is a convenience of human language to call gravity, the law of gravity, even though science would call it the theory of gravity. And so we have all these things that are regular, and we refer to them as laws. And you have these things that we call constants, and we say that they're always the same. What's the speed of gravity? Anybody remember? The correct answer is 32 feet per second per second. None of that 9.8 meter stuff. Actually, the meters make it easier. So 9.8 meters, 32 feet per second per second. That's gravity. You know that changes? Sometimes it's faster, sometimes it's slower. It's not a lot faster or a lot slower, but it changes. What's the speed of light? You didn't know you were coming to physics class tonight. 186,000 miles per hour, or 3.0 times 10 to the 8th meters a second. It's fast. Super fast. You know that changes too? These constants that we have, they change. Not a lot, but they change. Because in nature, there are no laws. There are no constants. But there are regularities. There are consistencies. And that's important because when we look at the world around us, really all we're doing is we're measuring stuff and trying to describe it. How hard would your life be if every day gravity was just totally different? Today it's 32 feet a second, and tomorrow it's 12, and the next day it's 400. Right? You couldn't do it. If the speed of light changed, if today it's 10 feet a second and tomorrow it's 100 million miles an hour, you couldn't do it. And so there is all of this consistency in everything that is created that creates this environment which is just perfectly suited to the thing that you are doing right now, which is called being alive. Why is that the case? And how come this is the only planet that has people like us on it? One of my favorite movies is from 1954. It's called Mars, the Red Planet. And people really believed, like in 1954, it's common to believe that there were actually Martians. And it's a movie about the Martians contacting the people on Earth and telling them that Jesus came there too, and if they would just follow all these rules, everything would be great, and they followed them, and Mars is this perfect Edenic paradise. And people were like, wow, this is real. They thought it was real. Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. You know why there are so many different species or races on Star Trek? Because he thought like every planet was going to have people on it. We have been looking for extraterrestrial life for a really, really long time. How many planets have we found with Vulcans? None. None. We've looked hard, right? None. Now, tomorrow they might show up, right? And it really doesn't change this argument, because the argument is just, why is the entire universe created in such a way that life exists on this planet the way that it does with people like us who are able to observe the universe around us. Why? It could just be chance. Or it could be somebody really, really, really is trying very hard to show you who they are. Like you have the heavens declaring the glory of God. All right, we tried to condense a lot down into just a short amount of time, and so I've got other notes. If you would like them, you're welcome to them. But this is how I would begin with somebody who had the question, why do you believe in God? What is it that even makes you think there is a higher power? Thank you for your attention and for your comments, and see you all next week.